Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, June 29th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Lavrov says that the US and Russia are in a fight of worlds. So, Russia's top diplomat said that Moscow can no longer trust Washington and that the potential for nuclear war has escalated. The Russian foreign minister suggested talks with American officials were possible, but that Washington has not made an effort to engage. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's remarks were reported in TASS on Wednesday. He said, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly that we are open for cooperation. But in regards to our former Western partners, we can no longer rely on agreements with them, including legally binding ones. It is a fight of worlds of sorts, end quote. So he went on to indicate that talks between the two sides are unlikely. He said, quote, each time Blinken requested contact, it happened twice in the last 18 months. I either answered his phone call or we talked on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali for about 10 minutes. But there were no more requests, end quote. So I think this is interesting because it goes to show, how bad Antony Blinken is at his job. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Blinken has only spoken with Lavrov twice, and it was once during a phone call. I believe it was June 2022 or maybe July. It was sometime in the summer of 2022, and they, were talking about a potential prisoner swap. The Brittany Griner Victor Bout swap that eventually happened. And then they also met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia last November, but they only met for about 10 minutes, just a 10-minute chat. And, that's not, nothing can be done in 10 minutes. And what's interesting is that Lavrov is saying that contact between the US and Russia has been done through Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, in the White House, rather than Blinken. That's how bad of a diplomat Blinken is that somebody else is doing his job. Of course, Sullivan is a leading foreign policy for the White House, but still, this is what you would think, Blinken should be doing. And Lavrov argued that part of the issue is Western leaders have stated they will indefinitely provide military support to Ukraine. He said, quote, they never answer the question it takes to do what. It is one thing to end the military campaign like they ended it in Afghanistan or in Iraq. It is probably a slightly different thing if they want to use this campaign to completely annihilate the Ukrainian army, end quote. And he's basically saying in Afghanistan and in Iraq, they were able to pull out, just get out of there. But in Ukraine, they're just kind of flooding the weapons and letting the Ukrainian army do the fighting. We are still in Iraq. They did pull out in 2011, but then went back in. So the diplomat said that Moscow has no plans to conclude the war before achieving its goals in Ukraine, and the Wagner insurrection had no major battlefield impacts. That's what the Russians are saying. And Lavrov warned that the deteriorating relationship between Washington and Moscow escalated the risk of nuclear war, blaming the U.S. for withdrawing from Cold War era agreements. So we know, in the decades leading up to the war in Ukraine, the Bush administration withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, and then the Trump administration withdrew from the INF Treaty, which banned short and medium-range land-launched missiles, and then also the Open Skies Treaty Trump got out of, which was a mutual surveillance treaty. So those are the things that he's mentioning there. All right. So the next one here, U.S. officials claim that Russian general knew about rebellion plans. So U.S. officials speaking to the New York Times said Wednesday that a senior Russian general knew that Yevgeny Prigozhin was planning an uprising, a claim that was dismissed by the Kremlin. So the U.S. officials are saying that intelligence showed that General Sergei Surovikin, who is the commander of Russian aerospace forces, and he's the deputy commander of Russia's war in Ukraine. He was the commander for a little while from November to January, and then he was replaced. But they're saying that he had knowledge of Prigozhin's plans. The officials said they were trying to figure out if Surovikin helped Prigozhin. And, it's certainly possible that he and other military leaders in Russia knew that Prigozhin was plotting something due to his frequent, criticism of Russian military leadership. And he did focus that on Shoigu and man, I'm blanking on his name, who the Russian general who's in charge of the war now, Gerasimov, I believe. So Prigozhin had a lot of criticism for them, and he actually he did say nice things about Surovikin. So I think that's what they're kind of hinting at here in this, what these U.S. officials are kind of probably why they're saying this. But right after, Prigozhin launched this mutiny, Surovikin issued an appeal to him calling for an end to the rebellion. It was in a video that he put out. So when asked about the New York Times report, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "I think that now there will be a lot of gossip, speculation on this issue. I think this is one example of that," end quote. So he's saying that it's gossip and speculation. So right now, there's no indication that Surovikin was involved in Prigozhin's mutiny. But on Wednesday, there was all these rumors going around in Western media, not really based on much, saying that he was missing, that he hasn't been seen publicly since the weekend. And later on Wednesday, the Moscow Times, which is now, I think they're based in the Netherlands, the Moscow Times, but they reported that Surovikin has been arrested, citing sources in the Russian Defense Ministry. But that report has not been confirmed. So you have this New York Times article, and then there's been a few other things kind of hinting that he might have been involved from Western media. And this is all coming out, again, amid these rumors that he's missing. So the New York Times report, we have to keep in mind that this could be an effort by U.S. intelligence to sow division among Russia's military brass. Last year, U.S. officials told NBC News that the U.S. was making claims about Russia to the public, even if they didn't have the evidence to back up the claims, as part of an information war against Russia. One of those claims was that Russia was preparing to use chemical weapons. According to these officials, they didn't have any evidence to prove that, but President Biden said it, So it goes all the way to the top here of the things that they are willing, and they say this is part of an information war against Russia, and it's also an information war against us, against, the American public and the rest of the world. So we'll see how this plays out. If Surovikin does end up getting arrested, I'm sure we will find out at some point if that's the case. All right, the next one here. President Biden says that Putin is losing the war in Iraq. So this is the, comic relief for the day. This article is from Zero Hedge about this. So President Biden was asked on Wednesday by reporters how he thinks Putin is doing, if he thinks he's strong, or I forget exactly what the question was, but this is the president's response.
It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home, and he has become a bit of a fly around the world. It's not just NATO. It's not just the European Union. It's Japan. It's 40 nations.
So saying that he's losing the war in Iraq, it's a Freudian slip, very interesting because, it's Biden, so he's pretty prone to gaffes, but we've seen similar things. I don't know if you remember a few months ago, or maybe it was last year at this point, I forget when exactly it was, but George W. Bush was giving a speech and he was talking about the invasion of Ukraine. And he said, because of one man's decision to launch a totally, unjust invasion of Iraq. And then he said, he shook his head and he said, well, Iraq too. And then he went on to talk about Russia and Ukraine. It almost seemed like an acknowledgement that he did launch an illegal, unjust invasion. It definitely seems like it's something that's on his mind to have a slip like that. And then a few days ago, also a French TV journalist challenged John Kerry. So I saw this and I didn't really think much of it because I keep forgetting that John Kerry is in the Biden administration. He's a climate envoy. I keep thinking he's just not in the government. He's just, a former U.S. official, but he is a current U.S. official. And basically this French TV host asked if it was a double standard between the U.S. position on Putin for his war of aggression in Ukraine and the fact that they don't think those standards apply to Bush for Iraq. And, John Kerry, claimed that it was not a war of aggression. And he said, oh, we didn't know it was a lie, at the time. And then I just did a quick Google search before this, but I saw in 2004 because Kerry voted, he voted to give Bush the authorization to invade. And about, in 2004, he was saying that he didn't regret it. So I just thought that was interesting. Lots of hypocrisy in the U.S. government. All right, the next one here. The U.S. approves a $15 billion arms sale to Poland. So this is another aspect, another way that the arms makers are cashing in. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The State Department announced it authorized selling $15 billion in advanced air defense systems to Poland. The deal comes as Washington wants to increase NATO's military presence in Europe. A press release distributed by the State Department on Wednesday says that the proposed sale will support the foreign policy goals and national security objectives of the United States by improving the security of a NATO ally that is a force for political stability and economic progress in Europe. U.S. and NATO leaders argue the alliance must build up its military presence in countries that border Russia to deter President Vladimir Putin's desire to expand his nation's border. However, Moscow has not indicated it plans to expand its border beyond eastern Ukraine, where the Russian military has struggled to secure territory annexed by the Kremlin. The sale is for an estimated $15 billion in Patriot air defense systems, radars, communications equipment. The primary contractors are Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, the two heavy hitters, the ones that are really making a lot of money on the war in Ukraine, and the fact that, post Russia's invasion, a lot of these European countries are increasing their military budget. They're spending more. They want to get rid of, if they have it, they want to get rid of their older Soviet stuff and replace it with new shiny stuff from the US. So it's just another way that they're cashing in on all, this crisis that's going on in Eastern Europe. All right, the next one here. NATO says that members will be defended from Wagner in Belarus. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Wednesday that the alliance is prepared to defend itself from any threat posed by Wagner fighters who go to Belarus. So after Yevgeny Prigozhin's short-lived uprising, Wagner members have the option of signing contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry, or they could travel to Belarus, or they could go home. Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, has denied rumors that they're building bases for Wagner in Belarus, but he did say that he's willing to accommodate the fighters. But at this point, it's unclear how many of them are going to end up in Belarus. But Poland is estimating that about 8,000 Wagner members are going to Belarus. And I don't know how they got that number, but that's what they're saying. And they're saying that they're going to beef up security on the Polish-Belarusian border. So Polish President Andrzej Duda wants NATO to discuss the issue at the upcoming summit in Vilnius, which will be held from July 11th to the 12th. He said, quote, "This is a really serious and very concerning, and we have to make very strong decisions. It requires a very, very tough answer of NATO," end quote. Stoltenberg said that it's too early to tell what Russia's presence in Belarus will mean for the alliance, but vowed NATO will defend every inch of its territory from threats in Moscow or Minsk. So since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, NATO has increased its presence in member states that border Russia and Ukraine. Stoltenberg said, quote, "We have already increased our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and we will make further decisions to further strengthen our collective defense with more high readiness forces and more capabilities at the upcoming summit," end quote. So we might hear more announcements of, the U.S. and other NATO countries. Germany just said they're sending 4,000 troops to Lithuania. So we might see more things like that. All right, the next one here, another one from the Libertarian Institute. This is from Connor Freeman. Switzerland vetoes plan to send 100 tanks to Ukraine. So Switzerland has vetoed a plan to send roughly 100 mothballed German-made Leopard 1 battle tanks to Kiev, citing its neutrality law. The decision comes as Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive has netted losses in armored vehicles. So Swiss arms maker RUAG AG requested a license earlier this year to sell the 96 non-operational tanks stored in Italy to Germany. The tanks would then have been refurbished and sent to Ukraine with Berlin's backing. 7 years ago, the tanks were procured from the Italian military So the Swiss government made clear that the proposed transaction would be inconsistent with applicable law. Switzerland has come under criticism from its allies in Europe who want the Alpine nation to support Kiev's war effort, including allegations that it maintains an overly restrictive interpretation of its long held and cherished neutrality policy. On Wednesday, Switzerland's Federal Council, the 7-person executive arm of the Swiss Confederation, declared that it has concluded that the sale of 96 tanks is not possible under Swiss law as it stands. So they're continuing their policy of neutrality, although I know Russia is not happy with Switzerland because they've, I think, frozen some Russian funds. They've gone along with some sanctions to a degree, but they're still not budging on this issue of sending weapons over there. And of course, this is getting them a lot of criticism from the U.S. and other NATO countries. So in March, U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland, Scott Miller, warned that as a result of its position, the country faces a dire political crisis. The French ambassador also lashed out, saying that Switzerland's stance constitutes a problem for Europe. So that's what neutrality gets you. Just a lot of criticism from the NATO countries. All right. So the next one here, the U.S. is unhappy that Israel leaked information on Iran talks. So Axios reported on Wednesday that the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed concern to his Israeli counterpart after Israel leaked information to the press about the U.S. and Iran holding indirect talks to reach an interim agreement on Tehran's nuclear program. So Iran has publicly confirmed that it has held indirect talks with the U.S. in Oman, but the Biden administration has not. The administration also denied reports that said the U.S. and Iran were close to an agreement for Tehran to reduce uranium enrichment levels in exchange for some sanctions relief and a potential prisoner swap. But Israeli officials were speaking openly about the potential agreement. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told Knesset lawmakers that the U.S. and Iran were working on a mini agreement. Citing unnamed U.S. and Israeli officials, the Axios report said that Sullivan and Israel's national security advisor had a tough call last week about Israel leaking the information. And Israeli officials said that Sullivan expressed frustration about Netanyahu's remarks. So it's kind of funny. The U.S. calls Israel to say, hey, stop leaking this stuff. And then Israel leaks, and Israeli officials here leaking information about that call. There's U.S. officials are talking about it too, but it's just funny. I've seen this before with Israel too. I forget what it was in the past, but the U.S. isn't happy that they're leaking things, and then they're leaking things about them not being happy about the leaks. So the Axios report, the Biden administration has tried to stay quiet about the potential deal with Iran because Iran hawks in Congress, which include, the vast majority of Republicans and some Democrats, a good amount of Democrats at this point, they would oppose any agreement with Iran, especially if it involves sanctions relief. A Western official previously told Reuters that one reason for Washington seeking an agreement with Tehran is to prevent an Israeli attack on Iran. Israeli officials are constantly threatening Iran over its nuclear program, but they are against any deals that would reduce its nuclear enrichment. So, of course, Israel's always claiming Iran is making a bomb, but there's no indication that they're trying to do that at this point. The Pentagon acknowledged that in their nuclear posture review last year. So, and of course, when we're covering this issue, it's always important to point out that Israel has a secret nuclear weapons program, and so they have nukes and Iran doesn't. All right, so the next one here, Blinken says that West Bank violence makes Saudi-Israeli normalization tougher. So this is from the Middle East Eye. So the ongoing violence in the occupied West Bank, which has seen a spike of Israeli settlers attacking Palestinians over the past week, is making it nearly impossible to make progress on a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, Blinken has said. Blinken said, quote, "We told our friends and allies in Israel that if there's a fire burning in their backyard, it's going to be a lot tougher, if not impossible, to actually both deepen the existing agreements as well as to expand them to include potentially Saudi Arabia. It's also, at least in our judgment as Israel's closest friend and ally, profoundly not in Israel's interest for this to happen," end quote. So that's kind of the big warning that the U.S. is giving Israel over all this violence that's been going on in the West Bank. We just saw Israel launched a drone strike there, first time since the early 2000s that they launched a targeted killing from an aircraft in the West Bank. There's been these raids and settler attacks, and this is kind of the big thing that the U.S. is warning them about, saying, "Hey, we're not going to be able to get you to get more normalization deals in the region." Nothing about, hey, maybe we should stop funding, giving them $3.8 billion a year in military aid. We can't have a conversation about that, of course, but and they're also expanding all the settlements and everything. So there's just a lot happening there. All right, the next one here, the U.S. and India can jointly deploy warships. So U.S. Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, said Wednesday that Washington and New Delhi can jointly deploy warships and warplanes in the Indian and Pacific Oceans as the two nations are increasing military ties. So he said this during a speech at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. He said, quote, "We can deploy our ships together in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and even beyond to ensure maritime security. Our air forces can also deploy across the Indo-Pacific region," end quote. He also called for greater interoperability between the two militaries. So also on Wednesday, Daniel Crittenbrink, who's the top State Department official for East Asia, he said that he expects the U.S. to increase cooperation with India in the South China Sea, which is a very sensitive area, the disputed waters there. Crittenbrink said that there would be greater collaboration in the disputed waters with the four Quad nations. And the Quad is the US, India, Japan, and Australia. And, they've been holding military exercises together since 2020. They started doing that. And this is what, the Hawks in Washington see the Quad as a potential foundation for, a NATO-style alliance in Asia. So the U.S. has been boosting military ties with India, and this is all about their strategy against China. Garcetti said that the purpose of the increased cooperation is to stand against those who would upend the common good. So Garcetti's speech came after Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, visited Washington on his first official state visit to the country. During his visit, Modi and President Biden signed a slew of agreements, including a $3 billion deal for India to purchase 31 armed MQ-9B Sea Guardian drones. That's the maritime variant of the MQ-9 Reaper drone that the U.S. uses a lot in its drone strikes in the Middle East and Africa. So the U.S. wants to step up arms sales to India to reduce its reliance on Russian arms. Biden and Modi also signed an agreement for General Electric to co-produce fighter jet engines in India. And something I always have to mention when we're talking about U.S.-India cooperation is the fact that the U.S. is helping India with the surveillance of Chinese troops along the disputed border in the Himalayas, known as the Line of Actual Control. And that's the result of a deal that they signed in 2020, so the U.S. can give them more intelligence sharing, specifically satellite intelligence. All right, the last story here, Quran burning protest in Sweden angers Turkey. So the Swedish government permitted a Quran burning protest that took place in Sweden on Wednesday, and this move, of course, angered Turkey and made it less likely that Ankara will approve Stockholm's NATO membership before the Vilnius summit in July. So Swedish police said that the approval was done in accordance with the right of free speech. Only one man took part in the demonstration, so just one guy burning a Quran near a mosque in Stockholm. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan condemned the protest. He said, quote, "It is unacceptable to allow these anti-Islamic actions under the pretext of freedom of expression. To turn a blind eye to such heinous acts is to be complicit in them," end quote. Turkey's director of communications also said that those who seek to be in NATO, quote, "cannot tolerate or enable destructive behaviors of Islamophobic and xenophobic terrorists," end quote. So earlier this year, there was another Quran burning protest in Sweden, and Turkey postponed talks with Sweden over its NATO bid because of that. So, this is definitely going to affect things, I think. U.S. and NATO officials have been hoping that Sweden will be granted their membership by July 11th, which is when the Vilnius summit will begin. But Erdogan has said that won't happen, and this protest, I think it gives them more of a reason not to sign off on it. And so it's interesting because Turkey wants Sweden, is involving itself in Sweden's domestic affairs quite a bit here. Their argument is that they give a safe haven to the PKK, which is a Kurdish militant group Turkey considered as a terrorist organization. But they're to placate Turkey. Sweden passed the anti-terror law. They approved the extradition of a Kurdish man, and because of that, that's sparking protests in Sweden. And Sweden and Turkey's getting mad at the protests. So hopefully this continues to play out, and Sweden stays out of NATO. But all right, that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter, Washington's continuing shame in Syria. One from Sheldon Richman, Foreign Policy Matters. One from James Banford, Julian Assange, and Arnon Milchan, The Lopsided Scales of American Justice. That is over at The Nation. And we have one from Norman Solomon, The Patriotism of Killing and Being Killed. That's an original for us. And one from Branko Marchteach, writing at Responsible Statecraft. We should not be cheering for state collapse in Russia. But that's everything for me for today. Go to support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you watch the video. Share the show. Tell your friends. Comment. Even if it's a negative comment, I appreciate it. That's everything for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.